All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Using Room for Android. I am the speaker today, Roger Odell. So let's kind of go to the next slide here. Oh, it usually helps if I'm on the right clicker. There we go. So who are we? Well, we are the GDG Kansas City chapter, and you can see there are three people displayed on the screen. I am one of them. I'm the guy in the middle, although don't let the webcam looks different than that. Jay is here with us. He's monitoring the chat for me. Kirti is not here today, but nonetheless, we are GDG Kansas City. And there's a lot of different ways to find us. You can see here we have multiple socials. Our community dev site, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you want to call it nowadays, and then YouTube. Of course, you can see I have a little screenshot there that kind of shows our site, the dev site, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. So what we have coming up next, we have DevFest Kansas City. That starts next Saturday. Hard to believe. That is next Saturday, and it will be at the UMKC Student Union. If you want any more information, go to devfestkc.com. Get your tickets now. This is one of, if not the cheapest developer conference anywhere. I used to say around here, but I'm just going to say everywhere. All right, so before I get into the topic at hand, just for everybody, this is being recorded for playback. So normally I sort of talk about myself, but don't always do that. So I didn't have a slide in here. But I'm not just an organizer, but I am a developer. But I'm also a lead trainer for a technology company. Where I train people to change their career path. So a lot of fundamentals courses and things like that. But prior to that, I spent a good portion of my development career as an Android developer working for some various Fortune 500 companies, military contracts, and some startups. So with that being said, today we're going to talk about Room. And we're going to take this from sort of an intro level. Okay, we're not going to get too far into the weeds, but we're going to kind of go over the different parts of it. But first, I like to ask, what is Room? Can anybody define what Room is? If I had a cricket sound, I would hit the soundboard. All right. Well, from the developer website, Room is a persistent library that provides an abstract layer over SQLite to allow for a more robust database access while harnessing the full power of SQLite. So if you thought for a moment that Room was replacing SQLite, that is not true. It basically makes it much easier to use the SQLite database, which is the main database that powers the Android system. Now, of course, I put the source for that right here. That takes you right to the base page. I'm not going to click on the link here, but it gives you a lot of base information about getting Room set up, and we'll kind of cover that here on another slide. Now, the material that was gone through for this particular session is based on these two code labs from Google Code Labs: persistent data with Room and read and update data with Room. These, the persistent one comes first, and then the read and update one comes last. These are sort of tied to each other. Now, my code sample is based on theirs. So we'll see some, well, you won't see similarities, but you might see it if you compare my code to theirs, because it's pretty close to being the same thing. Although you'll see in some screenshots here in a little bit how mine is different. Now, there are three main components of Room. The first one are entities. Now, I have here, they basically represent the tables in your database. You use them to update the data stored in rows while also creating new rows for inserts. Now, we have our data access objects, or DAOs, for Room. They provide methods that basically allow you to do the basic kind of CRUD operations, your updates, deletes, that kind of thing. Although they don't directly use the word CRUD in here, I sort of put it in here because you'll see, we'll be creating stuff and updating and deleting and all that. So, and then there is the main driver, the database class itself. So the class will provide the application with the instance of the DAOs associated with the database. And we're going to go into these in more detail than what I have here. But let's just put it this, before we even get to it, I'll just say that nowhere in this program that we're going to go through later have I created an extension of SQLite. So in the past, we had to create a class, we had to extend SQLite, we had to put all of this overhead stuff in. We had to do all kinds of either raw queries or special methods in order to query the databases to extract data out of it. What you're going to find with Room as we go through this is that none of that has to be done directly through SQLite. We'll do it through Room in a much more refined way. So with that being said, we're going to first talk about, well, first I want to show you this illustration. This came straight from the Code Lab, the persistent data. It just sort of talks about the layers of where everything is. A lot of what you're going to see is this abstraction from to sort of have this set of separation, which is important with programs. Is you want to have some layers of separation so it can be a more robust application, right? Right. Okay. So there are some dependencies. Now, these are my dependencies for my application. There are a lot more than the ones that are listed here. You'll see the first four. Those are your dependency parts, and then the ones below are the plugins that go at the top of your document. Now, when you get into the actual code labs, you won't be following necessarily these. The reason I had to update some of these is KSP. I had to update that one. It replaces another one. I don't remember what the other one was called. So it took a little bit of tweaking to get that set right. And I updated to the newest version of Room, which is different than what the Code Labs show. Now, the Code Labs came out right after I/O. So they're pretty fresh, but still changes are happening all the time. Now, you'll notice there that we also have Compose compilers. So needless to say, this the build I have is running on the Kotlin compiler, Compose compiler type system. It's different than what was in the Code Labs. So I had to update to the newest version of Android Studio. I had to update a lot of different things in order to be on the latest, greatest. So just know that there's a little bit of a difference between the way that the Code Labs are set up versus going out with the latest. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So we're going to start off by talking about the entity. This is the first one of the three that I listed. Now, the entity, this class defines a table, and each instance of this class represents a row in the database table. The class has mappings to tell Room how it intends to present and interact with the information in the database. You'll notice that there is an annotation in here, the first one being the entity annotation. And what it does is it marks this data class as a database entity. For each entity class, the app creates a database table to hold the items. Each field represents a column. Now, the primary key, as you can see here, is identified using the annotation primary key. And we also have it set for auto generation, which is pretty typical in most databases. Now, I did set a default value of 100, so that way it didn't start from 0. But the way the documentation reads, it primarily works with whole numbers. I'm sure you can probably do it with other fields, but you'll have to research those specifically in order to make sure that the implementation is right. Now, keep in mind, this is just one table in a database. So if you want more tables, then you will create other data classes with their own entity declaration. Now, you'll see that the name of the table is written right here within the parentheses of the annotation. This lets the database know that the table name is comics rather than the class name. So you can basically define the table however you want by name. Now, the second part of it was the DAO, or the data access object. Now, this is a pattern you can use to separate the persistent layer from the rest of the application by providing an abstract interface. The functionality of the DAO is to hide all the complexities involved in performing database operations in the persistent layer, separate from the rest of the application. Now, you have to create a DAO for every entity. It's not just one for all, it's one for each. Now, the Room library provides annotations, as you can see here, for insert, update, and delete. They define methods that perform simple operations without having to write SQL queries. Now, if you need to do something more complex, that's where the other annotation, @query. As you can see here, I have two functions, one for get item and one for get all items. And within the parentheses of the query annotation is where I have written the raw query that performs those particular operations. Now, if there was anything more complicated that I needed to do, I would have to write a query for that. But you can see how simple and straightforward it is because it's basic SQL script. Nothing complex here. Excuse me. Now, does anybody have any questions before we get to the database part? Okay, because I can't see the chat because I have my presenter view over here. All right, and so now we're going to start talking about the actual database itself. Now, there's a couple things we're going to cover, but in this particular part, this is the actual abstract layer. So the database class provides you with an instance of the DAOs you define. They can use the DAOs to retrieve data from the database as instances of the associated data entity objects. The app can also use the defined data entities to update rows from the table or create new rows for inserts. Now, you begin by creating this abstract class that you want to represent your database. You utilize the @database annotation, as you can see at the top of that screenshot there. This class is one method, and it has more than one, but one specific method that returns the existing instance of the Room database if it does not exist. Now, you might recognize that because it's a singleton pattern. Now, if you're not that familiar with SQLite, or really most databases follow a similar rule, you can only have one instance of it running at any time. If you try to open up one when it's already open, it will lock up the entire application. So by using this style, this singleton style, we can return back the instance if it's still active. Now, you'll see later and some other stuff where it'll be closed. So there's you still have this option to close it when you're not using it. Now, there is also a property that returns the DAO. You can see called comic DAO at the top there. It is listed as abstract. Now, the database annotation, kind of going back up to the top, excuse me, you'll notice that it has a bunch of stuff there in between the parentheses. First of all, we list the entities, and it's plural because it usually expects more than one. There's only one table in this sample database. And we looked at it earlier. We call it comic, and it's referring to it by its class here using the method reference. If I think that's the right terminology there. And then we also see that the version. So we know from working with SQLite that you or any database, you need a version number. Usually we start with 1. And if you make any changes to the schema itself, then you would increase it. However, 1.1 if you want to go with a decimal value or a whole value, just make it 2. Now the last part here, it says export schema. Now we have that set to false, and this will keep the version history. It will not keep any schema version history backups. I think I said that right. The way I have it in my notes here, but it's also in the code lab if you have any questions about that specifically. Any questions about the way we have this? Notice down in the singleton function there, where we actually name the database, it's called comic_database. That's the name of the file. So if you was to extract it out of the phone, it would be that.db. As you can see here, we have it references the comic database, gets the context. We're using the volatile annotation that is pretty common with singleton instances. And what it does is it helps prevent threads, keeps it limited to 1, if I remember correctly. All right. Now, along with setting these 3 things up, there is one other part that we have to play here, and that is working with offline. I have these 2 particular screenshots here. The first one, the one on the left side, is called is basically a repository interface. It is used to provide the insert, update, and delete and retrieve of, in my case, comics from a given data source. And you'll notice that it has flow well, it's in both screenshots, and you'll notice that if you don't know what flow is, it's part of a code routine, if I remember correctly. It's in my stuff. We'll look at it when we get there. Now it is implemented in the offline comics repo, and that is the class. It's on the right side. Now the class takes the DAO plus the it takes the DAO part of the constructor there. As you see, the constructor is put in right here, right after the name, and it implements this comics repository. So because of that, it implements those methods defined here, these functions, and they're basically tying the DAOs, particular methods, to them, sort of binding those. Now, here we go a little bit further with that by looking at the app container. Now, in the app container, you'll see there in that implementation where we actually tie in the offline repo. Now, a lot of this is done for you in the actual code lab. When you get into the code labs, you'll notice a bunch of this code is done for you. They have you do little bits and pieces. So I'm trying to explain some of the stuff that they do on your behalf, just so you kind of have an idea. But this container helps with as it says there, dependency injection. Any questions about what we got so far? All right, so one of the last main slides I have here is to talk about unit testing. Now, we can, and I will show you, unit tests that allow you to look at different operations that involve the room database as it stands by itself. And you can see in these 5 bullet points, creating the database, insert, update, delete, and then getting all records. So these are unit tests that you will actually write in those code labs as a part of verifying that the functionality of it works. And it's all completely independent from whatever your unit UI is. So this is just about getting the room database parts of it working. All right. Now, my main last slide here. I have one more left, but so I'm going to give you a demo. I'm going to show you those exact classes we just looked at. This is up on my GitHub, my comic collection. I'm sure we'll have a link somewhere in some place where you can look at it if you want. I'll probably be making some modifications over the next few months. Most of it will just be cosmetic. I was fiddling with this before our meet today because my computer at home and this computer, sometimes they clash with the UI. And so I've had to go in and play with color schemes, themes, things that are not really relevant to the demo, but I want to make sure you guys can actually see what it is that I'm doing. So that's why I have it like that. All right. So I'm just going to switch over to Android Studio. And hopefully everybody can see this real well. I know as an instructor, I've had to turn fonts up because people can't see things. So if you can't see anything, just let me know and I will, I'll turn it up. The code is definitely big enough, but like the stuff on the side, maybe not quite as much. Now the way that I have this, but I do have this thing right here. So my own Zoom. So you can see in the application, I have it broken down into a couple of components. So the main part of the data here, and these were the classes that we looked at in the slide deck. We're going to look at these again, just so you can see those. I also have the UI here, and the UI is split into smaller components as well. I can kind of zoom in here. You'll see we have it based off home screens, models, navigation screens, themes that have actually doesn't even apply to this app because it's doing its own color scheme. So what happens when you create a new project and it just does what it wants instead of letting you do what you want. So my focus was on the other parts, not on the UI. So you'll notice that. All right, so here are the files. I'm going to actually show you the app itself, and then we'll sort of discuss this. So, like I said, this has a very similar look and feel to the one you're going to do in the Google Code Lab. Now, the thing that's missing from the screen here is a set of text right here that says, hit the plus button to add a comic. It's there, just don't know why it's not showing on this machine, but it shows on my home machine. So, and it's in the code too. I was messing with this morning and it was driving me crazy. But there is some text there. It's just white on white. I think it's just drawing itself out. But I do have a little button down here so I can go in. I can hit plus. It's going to shift the screen over. Now we have these 3 particular fields. Then a name of a comic, a publisher, and an issue number. I wanted to keep this about within the same confines as what you get in the Code Labs. The Code Labs is like an item inventory list, where mine is comics related. So I can come in here and say something like Superman, and we can say DC Comics. And let's say it's issue 100. Save button. The save button, you can see now it's enabled. So there is some logic behind enabling this, and that you'll go through that when you go through the code lab too. As soon as I hit the save button, it shows up on the screen. You can see we have everything we need here. And I can continue to add more of them on here. If for some reason I had a typo, I can select it. You can see here, I can view what it looks like. You can see the titles versus what I entered. I can go in, I can edit. Here I can go in and I can change it to say, well, maybe this was actually 102 instead of 100. I can come back in, hit the save button, and it saves. Now, all this is happening on the database itself. I can turn the app off, turn the app back on, everything will still be there. Of course, we have our normal navigation. And so that's really it. I try to keep this within the same basic help as what the code labs have. So with that, we'll start with showing the actual entity, and I'm going to hide that for right now. So what I showed in the slide deck was the entity. So you can see here, I have a table called comics. We have our data class, our primary key, and all of our values. As far as the imports, we're going with Android X Room for those. We looked at the DAO. You can see here we have pretty much exactly as it was showing. Of course, you can see how the interface is tied in through the little annotation things that little graphics that they put on the side of Android Studio. As far as the imports, pretty much everything goes through Android X, and then of course the coroutines for Flow, which is what I was talking about earlier, because we're using Flow as part of taking that data out of the database and putting it into something that can be managed and then presented. We have the database itself. I'll kind of shrink this down so we can get it all in the shot here. So again, we have the singleton style with our get database function as an abstract class. As far as the imports go, we're still working within Android X. Now, as far as that goes, we can go into Gradle. I believe it's this one. So there is a couple of things over here that I didn't put in this database, and that is these two items here. I had to turn off the Compose compiler at this level and then turn it on at the other level. And then the KSP tools, I'm using whatever the current version is. The ones that were in the screenshot were the ones that was up here, our Android X Room version 261, KSP, and then the alias for the Compose compiler. Let's see. One of the things you'll notice through here is there was a function in some projects that show a compose function. You'll notice it's gone. I had to remove it because it was part of the older system. That's why there's a space right there. But going down past all of the other stuff here, we get to the implementation for Room, which is based on Android X. And then we had the KSP. Now, there is a whole lot of other things running in here. Most of this is all for the user interface. We're using Compose. As far as the JUnit goes, I have just the JUnit implementation here. It uses JUnit 4. Not sure why they haven't upgraded to JUnit 5 yet, but it's neither here nor there. If anybody else knows why they haven't updated to JUnit 5, I mean, how many years did it take for them to go to Java 11? And even then, that's a little sketch, from what I understand anyway. we're using Kotlin, so it doesn't matter. All right. So going back to these other ones here, we have our comic repository with the functions in it. You can see that we have our implementation, and that's through the offline comics repo. In here, we have our implementation. We're overriding those and providing direct access to the DIO's methods. So it's all handled under the hood for the most part. Just going to kind of close these out for a moment. And then the app container for the data is what helps with the dependency injection for the repo and the DAO and the offline. All right, so now it's about how does this stuff tie in? So it's one thing to create a database, but we need to be able to tie it in, right? We need to be able to use it. And we'll get to the testing stuff here a little later. We can start with looking at the home main screen here. Let me start with that one. All right. Turn off all the view stuff. All the way at the top. I was messing with this earlier, so let me see here. So the first thing we have to look through here is that original screen that I showed you that had the white on white, and then there's that floating action button at the bottom. So it has its item entry. This is all part of the navigation system. Let's see. This is the part that I didn't rehearse, so bear with me here as I'm looking through all this. Here's where it's supposed to say, no, comic issues in inventory, tap the plus to add. So that's what you were supposed to see instead of a plain white screen. So when we do have our comic list, we have the lazy column. It puts in the items. That's when you saw the image, the way it was displayed in the list. That's setting all that up here. Of course, that's the preview stuff. So let me see. View model. Probably not there either. Screens. So we'll start with the entry screen. So this was the screen that had the stuff that you had to fill in, you know, the name, the publisher, and all that. So go back to the top of the screen here. So we have our view models. This is all tied to our navigation. Just looking at the imports, there's a lot of components in here. Just checking to see. This probably doesn't have what I'm looking for. That's what happens when I don't rehearse this part. All right. All right, let's look at this one. So here's where we have specific things for our view model. So this is when you enter your data, you need to be able to save it. So you can see we have a suspend function here that ties in the repository and calls the insert comic. So this ties into your comic repository. Remember, we have this interface here with all of our different functions in it. So we have our save item, which actually does the insert. So, and what we insert is we get the detail item. So we have this extension function to convert our comic details to a comic. So we're calling that repository's insert method to insert the item. So the item is captured through the UI state. So we have, so it updates the comic UI state with the value provided in the argument. So we get our details and our input. Down at the bottom, we have sort of the data classes that represent the different items. So when we put in our name, our publisher, our issue, in order to capture those, we need to capture them in a data class. So this is the data class that captures those individual items. So the UI, basically the item is extracted out of the UI and is saved as one of these objects. And the object is then inserted into the database through that. So you can see here to item, this is where it says here extension function converts the details to the comic. The value of the price is not a valid double, and that's coming from the sample. I forgot to remove that apparently. So this converts the item to the item detail. In our case, it's a comic to comic details. So that basically takes all of that state from the item that you save and then converts it into an item object and then saved. Any questions or anything? Okay. Again, I didn't rehearse this part of it, so I usually don't rehearse all of these, so just bear with me on that. So we do have our details view model. So whenever you click on the item in the list, you get a detail view. This is that view that you got, and then you have the two buttons underneath. And so we have our view model here. Companion object, it's a timeout feature. Here we have, this is the suspend function for removing the item. So at the bottom of the detail screen, there were two buttons, one for edit and one for delete. So this delete item allows you to call the delete comic, which is the delete comic from the repository. So each time, each time we want to do some kind of function, we're calling these, and because this is tied into the DAO actually performs the operation. So somewhere in here, I should have the update, which I believe is probably that one. Yeah, so we have the update item right here. So it says if the valid input, if this is basically a valid statement, it will update the comic and basically performs an update action on SQLite, which just, if you know anything about those special operations, it doesn't create a new item. It just alters the existing item based off its ID. But everything all of this is all being handled under the hood. So we're not having to do any of it. I mean, you didn't see any SQL queries other than those query queries, right? So the updates, the inserts, they're all happened under the hood without us having to worry about writing it. So all good stuff. All right, so we covered all of those. Let's see. I'm going to go back to main for a minute here, because we still need to be able to get the data out of the database. Remember, we have those two query methods. So if we look at the query methods themselves from here, we have, get all comics stream and then get comic stream. We have these two. Remember, these are tied to those queries inside of the DAO. So if we look at where they're at, oh, come on, we can see that they're in the home view model. So in the home view model is where we actually pull that. So the view model gets all the items from the room database. So that's where that one resides. So we're calling we passing in the repository through the class, and we're using that in order to get all of the comics, whatever you have in your database, back out. And if we look at the get one, so this gets a single comic from the database. And this is actually tied to either the detail screen or the edit view model. So if we look at the detail screen, we have, I missed this one because I was looking at the other function, but we have inside our view model, we can get a specific comic. All right. Anybody have any questions about kind of how this works? I mean, I didn't want to cover the entire application because the rest of it is just basic Android stuff. But I just wanted to kind of tie in how do these functions and these things in the DAO and the repository tie into the rest of the content. So the last part I want to cover on here is going to be the actual unit tests. Now I'm going to close all of these. And we're going to look at how the unit test works. So inside of our Android tests, I have one file, comic DAO test. That's what I just happen to call this. So as you can see, it is running JUnit 4. Now I have a couple of variables up here, one for the DAO and one for the database itself. I have a couple of private variables, comic 1 and 2. You can see here I created basically objects of those. One's Batman, one's Green Lantern, same issue number and all that. So how many of you guys are familiar with unit tests in Android? Anybody besides Jay? All right. So if you're not, there are a set of annotations that you can use to help set everything up. In my classes, I teach JUnit 5, so but they're not that far off. There's only a couple of them that are slightly different. But we have these concepts of before and after. So you can see the annotation we have called before. Well, here we have a function that creates the database. So we get our application context. Then we use room in-memory database builder and assign it this to the variable that we did up on line 38 here. It says here, using an in-memory database because the information stored here disappears when the process is killed. So this has no effect on an existing database that might be in there. This is sort of just strictly for testing. It says allow for main thread query, and then it builds it. It just gets it for us. Now, once it's done, then we assign it to the comic DAO variable here, and then we'll use it later on. Now, the after is what happens when we're done. So after every test, or after all of them concluded, the database itself is closed. So we don't want to leave it open because what I explained earlier about you can only have one database open. So most of the rest of these are actual tests. Now, I do have some stuff at the very bottom, which I'm going to go to first. These are just a couple of functions. One creates one insert, one creates two inserts. That's why there's two variables at the top of the screen. Now, starting from the very first test, we want to test the insert item. So we have our function here with that particular name, DAO insert item. So this is inserting one item. And we have our blocking thing here. It's a coroutine. I'm used to writing unit tests in Java as opposed to Kotlin. So yeah, So I have this, this is that function from below, add one item to the database. And then once that executes, then I'm going to call our DAO's get all items, and we're going to take the first one. There's only one in there, but we're taking the first one. We're assigning it to this variable, and then we're running an assert method on it to verify that we got back what we were supposed to. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry about that. Ooh. So there we go. So this runs a basic assert verifying that we had one item. Now, we couldn't just have one that only tests one item. We want one that can test multiple items. So that's why we have the function for add two items to the database. And so much like the first one, we're getting back, in this particular instance, we're getting back all of the items. And this first here, as I hover over it, the terminal operator that returns the first element emitted by the flow and then cancels flow collection. So we're still getting all the items, but yeah, it's coroutine related or something. So we get all the items, and then here we run two assert equals items. Now we're checking positions 0 and 1. So it runs this test and comes back whether or not it works. Now you'll notice that we're going to throw an exception on these through the annotation as opposed to doing it within the function itself. I think it's just a Kotlin style as opposed to Java. I can't answer that. All right. So here we run a unit test that updates an item. So here we have add two items. So we have that same function from here. And then we proceed to update the item. You can see we're using the IDs. Now, these are not the issues. These are the actual ID numbers. Remember, we have the auto increment running in the database. And so we want to update the items, and we want to update. Let's see. I think I have them doing the same. They're not really updating if you really look at it, because the issue numbers didn't change. So I suppose we can change those and run it. What do you think? Make them 102. I'm going to run this unit test so that way we can see it. All right. So I'm updating the issue numbers from 100 to 102. There. So they're a real update. I must have forgot to change those numbers. At any rate, so after it runs the update, just like the previous ones, it gets all the items and then runs the assert equals methods and verifies that we got the correct numbers. Now, here it's saying that they should be 100. So I probably need to change these to 102 as well. So we'll just change that. We'll run this particular one. In fact, I'll run it by itself, thanks to our handy dandy little play buttons here. Gotta wait for the grade build to run. Sorry, my machine's full, so I'm not saying it's near death, but I am ready for an upgrade. I just need to donate a kidney so I can get a MacBook Pro. Probably have to donate both of my kidneys. Did you guys, did everybody see that they did release the M4 updates, and you got to take a car loan out and all? It's crazy. What's interesting is I priced out the Surface notebook that Microsoft came out with just as a comparison, and I can max ours out and hit 2,500. You can't even buy, I think you can buy the base model M4 16-inch Pro at 24 without making any changes to it.
Sounds right.
Yeah. They actually were right on par with each other. Not anymore. Yeah, this is taking way longer than I was expecting. I'm not sure why it's having to download all that. Maybe because I didn't run this machine. I ran on my machine at home. Well, the good news is once it finishes downloading all the stuff that apparently I didn't have, the tests will go much faster after that. So there is that. Since I don't do Android as my everyday job anymore, I had to install it this morning. So yeah, imagine I missed a few permissions in there. And there we go. So we got a valid test. As you can see, everything's green. Just kind of zoom in there and show you everything's green. We want to be able to say, okay, well, if I change this one to 3, then we should be able to run the same test and get a failure. Just to show that it's validated update. So, and this is something that's good to try, just to make sure that everything is working properly, that you can verify a failure. Shouldn't take as long this time as my machine is spinning up to take off. Fans are going pretty hard here. In the meantime, as we're sort of waiting on this machine, does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that we've done so far? And there we go. We have our failure. So switch that back to 2. Now, moving on, we also have a test for deleting items from the database. So much like the other ones, we have the same add to. We're calling the delete method twice on each one of these. These are the variables at the top that's based off of those specific items. Then we try to get all the items and then discern whether it is empty with the assert true. And this particular one here, we have return items. So this is basically using the get item verification, getting one item out. We're specifying it by ID, which is the way that particular method works. So we add one item, we attempt to get it out, we verify it. It's pretty straightforward. We can certainly run all of the tests. I don't know if you guys want to sit through that after setting through those other 2, but the way that this is currently set up, they all come back true and good. So that's pretty much all I have for this. You'll go through all of this stuff in those 2 code labs. As I said, there's plenty of stuff to read. You won't have to create everything. They'll tell you exactly what you need to create. So I'm going to go back to here now. So I only had one slide left, which was just basically a repetition of the links for the code labs. If Room is something that you want to learn, then this is a good place to start. You'll go through a very similar app build. As I said, these are the same app is tied to both of these. They have other Room ones, but these are a good starting point. And I think it really helps. I mean, I never had Room to use when I was working in the Android space, so it's definitely way better than all of the stuff that I had to do years ago. So I will say that the database class where you had that singleton is actually, and they even say this in the code lab, you can actually copy that and save it because it's pretty generically built. You just update the things that you need to update that reflect whatever you're working on. Now, what I haven't actually looked into yet in Room as far as what I want to do is find out how I can tie an existing database into a project and then use Room to interact with it. My assumption, without reading anything on it, is that it should still be able to tie in through that class. You just have to tell it where the file is, right? So we can add files directly into Android, which is the way I used to inject a database into a project if I had it already built ahead of time. Because the last thing you want to do is generate a class that generates data just so you can have it from the beginning, which I've done that too. So working with an existing database, that's probably the next step. Once you kind of understand the basics of how Room works. So that way you can start with something existing. I guess the other thing would be working with cloud content, bringing stuff down and saving it. I don't think there would be that much of an issue there because you would just basically have your own entity set up, your DAO set up and everything based off of whatever that is, whether it's a JSON script coming down or whatever it is that you're using with whatever cloud process you're working or API or whatever. Sorry. The last slide that got slid in here is DevFest. So again, DevFest KC next Saturday. It's going to be at the UMKC Student Union. Sorry, I tried not to cough here. But if you want more details, go to devfestkc.com and join us next week. It's going to be fun. It's always fun every year. A lot of food, a lot of friends, a lot of good talks, got a lot of variety. And we have 2 Googlers. Yes. And
trying to get a third. We'll see.
We're working on a third. Got some Google developer experts. They're going to be there. And we have some other speakers as well. And swag. If you like swag, you got to come get the swag. Now, don't just come in, pay your money, get the swag, and leave because, you got to stay for everything else because, we have giveaways. There are going to be giveaways there. You want some giveaways. We're not talking about terrible giveaways. We're talking about stuff like Chromebooks, other tech. Anyway, that's it for me. Anything else we need to do?
I don't think so.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.